So I don't think that most talented people are actually talented, or at least how we usually mean it. Have you ever shown your work to somebody and they say a variation of,
"Oh wow, you're so talented. I could never."
growing up, I had a friend who would say that to me all the time, and I never really knew how to take it. Because on one hand, it sounds like a wonderful compliment, but to me, a compliment is simply something like, I really like your work, or I think you're good at this, and leave it there, leave it at that. But from this specific person in my life, it never really sat well with me, this notion that they could never do something that I had learnt to do. It's essentially, to me, a loaded statement, and one that I'd like to unpack right here, right now. When we talk about talent, we mean someone who could do something very well, but that this is an innate ability. They don't just do something well, they do it easily. And there's this heavily loaded expectation that this ability is innate or God-given, and that this skill just comes naturally to them and they don't have to put much work into it. But I think that idea creates a kind of divide between people who have talent and people who do not. And I don't know about you, but I'm not sure whether I agree with these ideas. And so the more I actually look at any skilled work, especially in arts and crafts, it actually becomes harder for me to agree with or believe in this idea of this God-given talent, because what I see instead is repetition, time, mistakes, and a lot of work that sometimes we just don't see. And so as somebody who loves to learn new skills, value education, when I do catch myself marveling how talented someone else is, especially at a skill that I wish to learn, and when I wonder why it is so hard for me, or wonder why I'm having difficulties, I remind myself that that version of that person that I'm seeing is a result of years and years of practice, of making mistakes, of learning new skills and honing an ability that I now wish to learn. And that is usually all I need to send me on my way and knuckle down and learn that skill. But when this idea that skills require work to acquire and to maintain, instead of just appearing in someone fully formed and ready to go, that skill is then dismissed as talent. And I think in this way as well, the idea of talent actually performs quite an interesting role for all of us. So returning to my friend's comments, I want to go back to the other part of their statement when they say, I could never. Or maybe you, as crafters, can also identify with friends saying to you a similar variation of,
"I don't know how you have the patience to do that."
"I don't have the patience to knit that garment."
I do not see these comments as compliments. They are self-deprecating comparisons, sure, but they don't really tend to make the receiver feel good about the skills that they have. Why should I feel good about something that you think I have and that you think that you lack? Because I'm sure if we looked at the matter more deeply, we could both find things that you do and I probably don't have the patience for. That's just a fact of life. So that's why these kinds of statements tacked on to what could be genuine compliments turn statements into backhanded compliments. And similarly, when we say that this person is very talented to do X, I think it's a convenient dismissal of the time and effort it possibly could take to learn to do those skills. And it's a convenient dismissal as to why we ourselves haven't achieved the greatness that we perceive another person has. There needs to be some nuance in this conversation. I heard once that somebody say of Beyonce that Beyonce has the same 24 hours in the day as we all have.
I have work to do. I got a job, baby.
So if Beyonce can do as well as she has done, then that means obviously that everyone else can do the same. Now, loves, I'm sure we all know that life simply does not work like that. Greatness takes time, money, and other resources of epic proportions. And not everyone has access to that kind of support and encouragement and resources, even on the most basic level. So forget about Beyonce. If I was to knit a sweater that a friend sees and compliments it and says that they just don't have the time to learn to knit a sweater, that's actually a different story. Because if she's juggling full-time work and a child, that is a completely different thing to saying one person has talent or patience that the other hasn't. To get better at something, you do need the luxury of time to learn that skill, to allow yourself to be bad at something for a time, to enjoy the process of learning, and to be in the exploration phase when the outcome doesn't matter. That kind of time and exploration is not available to everyone, and somehow it does take the wealth of time and money to do so, and most of which have very little to do with talent. So I think we are attached to this idea of talent because it gives us something to cushion ourselves with. I'm no good at that because I never learned properly, or I didn't put in the work to learn, or I gave up too soon, or simply I didn't have the resources to learn. These are all completely valid reasons as to why we suck at something, but it doesn't go any way to explain anyone else's talent. So I have come up with 4 separate but not mutually exclusive ideas that we could use when instead of talent when we want to use that word. If of course we are working with the dictionary defined word. So just as a reminder, we're thinking about abilities that are innate and God-given and effortless, just so we're on the same page. Instead of talent, reason 1, they had early exposure to the skill. So I think early exposure is super important and goes a lot further to describe why someone may be good at something compared to somebody else, simply because they were exposed to it at an early age. So I'm a fan of reading and watching biographical books and films. And what I've noticed in the main, when you have these stars in particular fields, one of the things that they have in common is that they were exposed to whatever it was that they do incredibly well at an early age. So while I was thinking about this video, about making this video, the long-lasting example that I have that stuck with me when I watched it was the scene in Tina Turner's What's Love Got to Do With It biography, And there is a scene when she's a little kid and she annoys the choir instructor at church, and she's singing This Little Light of Mine, and she's actually out singing everybody. She annoys the choir lead and gets put out of the church. Tina Turner she was singing in the church. She enjoyed singing, the gospel from a very early age. So this is what she did. This is a familiar take. Edith Piaf with Whitney Houston. You always see that they were singing from a very young age. If they already had the talent and they were born with that talent, how would we know? How do we make that distinction between an innate ability and being exposed from a younger age? I'm not sure, because scientists are still trying to work out whether talent actually exists, and there doesn't seem to be any conclusive ideas about this subject. So, but this is what I believe. There are also certain skills that are much easier to learn and to be proficient at when we are younger, such as language acquisition or sports or art practices, especially when we are not burdened by the judgment that we tend to have as we get older. When we are children, we are free to make things, to explore, to repeat things, to play. All of these aspects are vital when learning a skill. So early exposure versus nepotism. I would also say that early exposure is another reason that I think that nepotism is so rife. Apart from if somebody is in an enviable position in society, so for example, if they are some kind of entertainment star, they are going to want the same privileges for their offspring. That's just evolution. That's just humanity. That's human nature, right? So I'm not going there with this topic, but we're talking about early exposure and nepotism. So if you look at the children of industry stars and why they are very likely to end up not necessarily within the exact same environment as their parents, but some kind of entertainment adjacent. They tend to follow within the footsteps, at least within the same industry or similar or adjacent creative field. So for example, you could have the children of a TV producer who goes on to be a visual artist or a musician. We see it all the time. I found this article on BuzzFeed about how these particular Nepo babies are undeserving of their fame and what have you, and I'm not sure whether I agree with all of that. I mean, a lot of the people here, I only really have a vague idea of who they or their famous family member or members are, but my gosh, the original point aside, if nepotism is so rife among vaguely famous people, imagine how prevalent it is among Hollywood elite, and we just don't know about it. At this point, it's worth pointing out the differences that I think exists between somebody who has had early exposure and nepotism. When comparing cases of nepotism versus early exposure, I think there is a lot of overlap, namely the resources that they have access to and the ability to use those resources in beneficial ways. However, I would say that that's where it stops for products of nepotism. So for me, the distinction between early exposure and nepotism is the level of skill. When faced with most Nepo baby occurrences, it's mostly always clear to see those who are simply the benefit of having good contacts or having famous parents versus those who used the advantages available to them to further their skills and to further their career, to develop those skills that they have. So whether you have the resources or you have the God-given talent or ability, you still need to put in the work to develop those skills. You cannot simply rest on your resources that you have around you. So reason number 2 that I think, instead of using the word talent, we should consider when we see that somebody is very good at what they do. Somebody has simply had a lot of practice with what they do. And I think I'm stating the obvious here, and I think this one is pretty self-explanatory. So it could also be argued that if somebody has had early exposure to a particular skill, then if they continue to practice that skill well into adulthood, then of course they're going to be really good at that skill. So you can say that reason 1 and reason 2 are intertwined. So meaning that without even really thinking about it, somebody just gets good at a skill well into adulthood. But it's important to note that simply getting started early is not a surefire way to get good at a skill. If you have the determination to get good, yes, then you surely will find success with whatever you choose to do or you want to get good at. So number 2, they have had lots of practice. They have just done something for a long amount of time. Reason number 3, is someone talented, or do they really just have good taste? Now, hear me out, because with taste, we're not really talking about being good at mathematics or geography. Here, mostly talking about creative pursuits. All creative pursuits require taste, which I'm going to be defining as the ability to discern what looks good, what sounds good, and what goes well together with regards to aesthetics or sound if we're talking about music. So essentially, it's about the discerning judgment to artistic endeavors. For example, what musical notes sound good together to recreate a particular kind of feeling? That's essentially what music making is and requires a great degree of taste. It's not really having an eye for something or natural talent, because if you really think about it, taste has to develop before skill develops, because taste requires exposure. There's that word again, because taste requires observation and references. Art doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it's quite fun to watch interviews of artists and musicians when they are asked about their inspiration and their references. Musicians especially tend to grab references from all over the place, because the good ones are continually being inspired by the world, by all kinds of things. And that is observation and referencing and exposure as well, because they know that eclecticism builds taste and creativity by taking, a little of this from here, a little of that from there. They can then put it together and create something new, create something of their own. That's not necessarily talent, but it can be resourcefulness. What could actually manifest within somebody as talent or good taste is essentially finely tuned pattern recognition. What I mean by that is aesthetic knowledge is pattern recognition. For example, designing a great fitting knitted garment requires knowledge of drape, of pattern design, of material knowledge, of texture, of color balance, of silhouette. All of that is pattern recognition. In photography, it requires knowledge of lighting, of framing and composition, of knowing your camera and how it functions, the knowledge of different settings, all superior forms of pattern recognition, and it's a learned skill. And after enough exposure, you get to begin to just feel when something just works. And of course, anyone would be forgiven in thinking that all of that knowledge and work is simply talent. And the fourth and final skill that is largely thought of as talent, and is probably from an evolutionary point of view, probably the hardest to explain and is often confused with talent, is aptitude. The word aptitude a lot of the time is used interchangeably with the word talent. If we define talent as a God-given ability to do something, or to do something effortless, I think aptitude needs to be thought of as the ability to learn very easily, learn a skill with ease. Yeah, so it's the aptitude focuses on the learning aspect of a skill, whereas talent focuses more on the ability to have that skill or the ability to do something. So you can imagine if you were to combine early exposure with aptitude, when you combine the two like that, I think we would be quick to describe that as talent. If aptitude is the ability to learn something quickly, aptitude facilitates any development of skill that could easily be described as talent. While a lot of studies that I found on the subject described aptitude as also innate and God-given, it will probably surprise you to learn that I'm no neuroscientist, but I believe, like a lot of things, aptitude can also be taught and developed, strengthened in the same way as I've described talent can also be. Let's take those aptitude tests that they use sometimes during the hiring process. In those tests, they're not obviously testing somebody's ability to learn anything, because nothing has been taught within those tests, right? You've met the hiring manager like an hour ago and they've given you a test. It's a standardized test which tests things like logical reasoning and problem solving skills. Those kinds of tests you can definitely learn to be good at. And you want to know how? Via exposure, by drilling, by taking those types of tests over and over and over again is how you get good at them. So another lifetime ago, I taught at an international secondary school somewhere in Europe. And at this particular school, part of my duties were to tutor the SATs and in some cases the PSATs. Now, we're not talking about the SATs for 11-year-olds as they take in the UK. These were the American SATs and PSATs that they take in their senior year of high school. So I used to tutor the language portion of these tests, bearing in mind that personally, I have never taken an SAT or a PSAT. I did not attend an American secondary school. nor have I been through the American school system as a student, nor have I had any formal training on these particular tests. However, most of my international students, bearing in mind for the vast majority of these students, English was probably their second or third language, learned language. But my students did very well. So we're talking 500, 600 score tests because of drilling and test taking instruction. But these high level scores in the English portion of the tests were not necessarily a reflection on the student's ability to write a well-crafted essay or speak high-level English. My point is, aptitude can be crafted and developed in a similar way as preparation for any standardized tests through repetition and repeat exposure. And this is the same, I think, for the ability to learn anything for the average person. Now, I'm not talking about people with learning differences. For the average person, we have the capacity to learn a lot of things. I just think making an effort to learn a variety of things throughout our lives can help our neuroplasticity by continually engaging different parts of the brain. So similarly, like when we go to the gym, we don't, contrary to popular beliefs on social media, not all women just work on their glutes. We do need to work every muscle group, including the brain. Early exposure, practice, taste, and aptitude can all be used to describe skills instead of talent. But the real barrier to success is not a lack of talent, it is quitting too soon. How many times did you try to learn a skill and at first everything just looked awful, looked terrible? And of course that feels bad. It feels awful to be bad at something. It's a knock to the ego because we want to believe that we have the aptitude to do anything that we want to do, anything that we put our minds to. Now, I won't claim that I'm any kind of expert at knitting, but I can certainly read a pattern and follow it and make a wearable garment at the end of the process. It's not talent like my non-knitting friends might want to believe. Because if it were truly a talent, I wouldn't have a wealth of mistakes and bad, unwearable garments under my belt. This was the very first garment I knitted, made of 100% acrylic using jumbo needles. So through videos on YouTube, I learned how to cast on. So I think at this point, when I made that cardigan, I had learned how to cast on and knit. I don't think I even knew how to cast off at that point. I couldn't read a pattern. Actually, I refused to learn to read a pattern for the longest time. I just thought I could self-draft whatever I wanted to knit. And that cardigan was self-drafted and it 100% looks it. I just knew, at that point, I wanted to knit a cardigan. So I did. It was an ugly as shit cardigan, but I did it. But the point is, with time, I learned and improved my skills. So to a point where I can now make a wearable garment. So I held on to that cardigan for the longest time. It sat at the back of my wardrobe for many years because I was waiting for the day to show it in a podcast episode. And then I decided that I wanted to show it in this episode and I just got rid of it. But the reason why I never showed it in the beginning or in any podcast episode prior to this is I was embarrassed. I was too embarrassed to show my first ever garment that I knitted. And this is the part that we just don't talk about. Being a beginner at a skill publicly. Literally all of the content creators or the posts written by self-professed beginners or people claiming to be beginners, but the level of the work that they show online looks very high level, propagating this fake notion of natural talent. So I saw it on a post the other day. I think this was on a craft or a knitting subreddit. So there was a post by somebody who it was a cardigan or something like that, saying that it was their first knitted garment and it was perfect, right? There was no obvious errors. And somebody in the comments said something like, oh, I feel really bad about my knitting now because I'm in no way a beginner, but even the things that I produce is not at that level. Seeing how well this beginner's item had turned out had caused somebody to feel bad about their own work despite not being a beginner. But it was only then that the original poster said, oh yes, I am a beginner at knitting, but I have experience with crochet. So of course their knowledge of knitting and yarn management, etc. is not starting at zero. In a way, their knowledge of crochet has developed their aptitude to take on knitting and learn it very quickly. But it's funny because that person overlooked the point that they have knowledge of a similar fiber art, so therefore they're not starting at zero. Because obviously it feels nicer for people to think that you have this innate talent for something. So for most of my life, I believed that talented people were simply born closer to creativity than others. Like they had access to this innate ability, that it was an exclusive club, and that they had access to an ability or an instinct that had missed everyone else. But the more time I spend around other creative people and the more time I spend trying to make things myself, the harder that idea becomes to blindly accept. Because when you stop to think about and analyze what we so naturally dismiss as talent, the more we can see the components of it, which usually consists of exposure, practice, taste, aptitude and learning, time and encouragement, and of course persistence, which maybe is the most important. A willingness to continue to move through the exploration phase and a willingness to be bad at something in the beginning. I think the myth of natural talent survives because it's comforting. If creativity belongs to only the gifted few, then the rest of us never really have to risk failing, or risk failing publicly, or to endure the humiliation of making something ugly, or to really confront sometimes how difficult learning something new can be. This video is for those people who stopped drawing at a young age because somebody else seemed better at it, or people who never picked up a musical instrument to learn because they thought of themselves as not musical, or to people who just simply convinced themselves that they weren't creative because their minds don't work that way. And maybe that's really what my beef with natural talent is. Not that natural talent doesn't exist in anyone at all, but that we treat creativity as something that only exists within a select or lucky few, when in reality most creative people weren't born fearless or brilliant. They just kept going. They just didn't quit long enough for that practice to start to look like something resembling talent, because it means that creativity and talent may not just be a rare gift after all. I hope you enjoyed this video essay. Like with everything I'm trying to put out there, it gave you a bit of encouragement to try your hand at something creative. So speaking of which, I still have a few more things left in the shop, last few bundles to go before I restock the shop with other things. So I've left a link down below, so go ahead and check out what I have to offer, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye.